by no details, no contact number, no nothing. But I'd done my homework. I had his home telephone number, and on the plane I had good reading material thanks to Google. I mean, what had happened with General Hill, with Dunleavy, with others, they would Google me the day before I arrived. As I do when I'm meeting someone. The day before, who on earth is this person? Why am I meeting them? What's their background? You Google the person, and obviously in my case they saw Lawless World and other things that they ought to have checked much earlier, and they're probably now deeply regretting not having checked. James Hill did that, bailed out, but I'd Googled him. And one of the things that I discovered in his retirement, as he now was that he and his wife liked doing nothing better than cooking risotto. And it was the risotto technique of opening the door to meeting General Hill, because I put on my best and sort of most unctuous English accent to gain access to these people, and engaged with Mrs. Hill, who was a charming lady, on the subject of risotto. And I'd come all this way, and I was in Miami, and I was a really nice, honest English person. You know, Americans like English people. We're your closest ally in the war on terror. We love America, and I love risotto and Italian wine, and please can you introduce me to your husband? And it worked. She was really lovely, and she tracked him down, and we had another terrific meeting in the Biltmore Hotel, and from him, as you will read in the book, I got a great deal more information. I began to pick up a composite picture, and I was carrying on making my way up, getting in touch with people, often through their spouses, interestingly enough, because the spouses worked, and you could often not find the personal email for General Myers, but you could find the email for Mrs. Myers, who worked for a consultancy in Washington, D.C., and I wrote yet another sort of unctuous email. Oh, dear Mrs. Myers, I'm having trouble tracking your husband down, and I'm an English academic writing a book about lawyers and the war on terror, and could you possibly forward this email to your husband? And it worked the trick, and I was soon meeting with General Myers in Washington. And two things came out of the meeting with General Myers that were totally staggering. One, he had no idea that the Geneva Conventions had been set aside. He thought they had decided to apply the Geneva Conventions to people at Guantanamo. He thought that had been the decision. He was in a state of abject confusion about what had been decided. And point number two, he thought all of these new techniques of interrogation had been lifted straight from the US Army Field Manual. And I still recall to this day going through the techniques one by one as his jaw literally dropped and he realized what he had in effect signed off on. And I thought he was a decent man of integrity who was completely out of his depth and had been bamboozled by people like Doug Feith and others. The next person that I needed to see was the person who signed off on the memo. By the time I met with him, I had already been able to ascertain what had happened in relation to the period between the 25th of October 2002 and November 2002. And it was this. Jim Haynes had intervened and taken the paperwork away from the Joint Chiefs, short-circuited the normal decision-making process, and brought it straight to Donald Rumsfeld. And so the normal techniques and processes of authorization, which would have required input from the senior military lawyers, the career lawyers, they were completely bypassed in the process, and they had no input. The process was short-circuited. Jim Haynes declined to meet with me, until a good friend of mine who writes for the New Yorker said, what you need to do is send him a Bob Woodward letter. What, I said, is a Bob Woodward letter? There's a good lesson in this for everyone in this room. Terrific. Once you've spoken to one person, you can get access to anybody. A Bob Woodward letter has just 3 paragraphs. Paragraph 1, Mr. Haynes, here is a list of 18 people I have spoken to on the record. Paragraph 2, here are 3 really appalling things they've said about you. Paragraph 3, this is your last opportunity to speak to me. And amazingly, key in the door opens, I'm in the Pentagon, twice, to talk with him for 3.5 hours about the circumstances in which he signed off on that memo. Now, I'm not allowed to talk about those circumstances, at least in this room now today, because they were off the record. But the fact of the meeting was on the record. And the fact that the fact of the meeting was on the record means that I can structure the book in such a way, come to my meeting with him towards the end, and then say, all of the conclusions which follow in the final chapter, which you are about to read, take into account everything Mr. Haynes said to me. That is not revealing anything about the content of the conversation. And from all of these meetings and others, I was able to put together the whole story. And the whole story also includes a number of real American heroes, truly decent, honourable people, who were the vast majority of the people that I met. This is essentially a story of a coup d'etat, a small group of political appointees who took over the system and bypassed the honourable career officials and lawyers in the military, in the FBI, in the Naval Criminal Investigation Service, and elsewhere, and imposed a policy, whatever the law actually said. Now, from this, it became clear that two central points emerged. One, the most senior lawyers had been down at Guantanamo and had been involved much earlier directing the whole thing, creating a climate of fear and pressure in which these memoranda were requested. That's what happened. And point number two, even more significantly, I discovered that the memo by Diane Beaver was a total irrelevance. Because Jim Haynes had, in his mind, if not in his back pocket, knowledge of the contents of another memo, a very famous memo, that had been written in August 2002 by a lawyer called John Yoo, now teaching at Berkeley Law School, which authorized, in effect, these techniques of interrogation. The administration has always denied that there was any connection between John Yoo's memo and the decision to interrogate Mohammed al-Qahtani. They've always said the John Yoo memo was just for the CIA, not for the military. That's not true. That is false. It's not accurate. I established absolutely clearly that Haynes had knowledge of the contents of the John Yoo memo by the time he signed off on the techniques of interrogation, which of course meant that Diane Beaver's legal advice was irrelevant. Because in the US system of government, a legal memo from the Office of Legal Counsel of 1st of August 2002 binds every arm of government. Why were they getting Diane Beaver's legal advice when they already had John Yoo's memo? Well, they needed Diane Beaver's legal advice because they needed to create a narrative which said this was bottom up and we're going to shaft Diane Beaver, which is what they did. As she described to me, she got no notice of her legal advice being put out. Any lawyer in this room will know that the confidentiality of legal advice is a sacrosanct principle. And at the very least, what they could have done is they could have blacked out her name. There was absolutely no need to make public her identity. They could have protected her. They chose not to do that, and in my view, they chose not to do that precisely because they needed a scapegoat that they could basically point the finger of blame at. And that is, in essence, the cover-up that has occurred. The few bad eggs were not at the bottom, the few bad eggs were at the top. And the few bad eggs at the top took steps to bypass a normal decision-making process that would never have allowed this to happen. Now, what happened from then? There was migration. I want to bring this to a close in order that we can have time for some questions. There was migration. There was migration from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib. That is clearly established. You don't need to accept my word for that. 3 independent military investigations have concluded that there was migration. This and other memos were found in the computers at Abu Ghraib. It created a climate in which it's very difficult to prove precise cause and effect, but at the very least, the senior military commanders at Baghdad and at Abu Ghraib had knowledge. The Secretary of Defense had authorized techniques of interrogation, which had at the very least sent out a signal to say,